I'm very pleased to start the 23rd Annual Russell B. Clark Gerontology Conference. Throughout his life, Dr. Clark defined what successful aging really is. His zest for living and competitive spirit was truly remarkable. And I remember his comments after he completed a race at the Huntsman Senior Games. I believe he was about 101 or 2. I can't remember which year it was we saw him. And he said he was really worried that he was going to be beat by this 97-year-old. And he said that wouldn't look good to be beat by a young guy. That's the type of spirit that he had. And he was truly a remarkable man and has left a legacy that he and his family can be proud of. We are pleased to have his daughter with us tonight, Beverly Johnson, her husband, Dr. Dale Johnson, representing the Clark family. Also present are other donors who have graciously supported our students and our faculty throughout the years. We greatly appreciate their efforts on our behalf. Likewise, I recognize Dean Ogles from the College of Family, Home and Social Sciences, Dean Patricia Ravert from the College of Nursing, and Dean Rodney Brown from the College of Life Sciences, and the many chairs and directors from our sponsoring departments. We are very delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Rosemary Blieszner with us to present our keynote address tonight. I'm confident you will enjoy her presentation tonight and invite everyone to attend her research presentation that will occur tomorrow at 11 o'clock in B190 of JFSB. We've expanded the conference this year to include research reports from 2 of our recent Gerontology Award recipients. They are listed in your program that you have. This is Dr. John Kauwe from the Department of Biology and Dr. Brent Nielsen from the Department of Microbiology and Molecular Biology. We appreciate their willingness to report on their research. So it's a great delight I have tonight to start this conference off, and the program will proceed as outlined.
Good evening. It's my opportunity to represent Brigham Young University's administration and welcome you here this evening. We're glad you could be here. We especially welcome Dr. Blieszner here from Virginia Tech to give this lecture. Hope she has an enjoyable time at Brigham Young University. Also, I'd like to just express thanks to Von Kahl and his staff and all the many faculty and students who are in the gerontology program. We appreciate your work. As I've gotten to know the gerontology program as a relatively new dean here at Brigham Young University, I'm especially impressed with the interdisciplinary nature of it. I see projects often that have a faculty member from life sciences and then someone from nursing and someone in our college and in the social sciences, family, home, and social sciences, working together on very innovative projects. We thank them for that great work and for the opportunities they're providing to our students and for your support, those of you who support those programs. I was talking with Dr. Clark's daughter, Beverly Johnson, just a few minutes ago, and she reminded me that even before this conference, there was the Russell B. Clark Gerontology Essay Contest, and I'd forgotten all about it, but in like 1983 I participated and actually took 3rd place in the essay contest. So it's been around, and I was one of those beneficiaries many, many years ago, so I'm very grateful to the Clark family myself. I hope you enjoy this evening and get a feel for the research that's happening here, and also get to learn from Dr. Blieszner while she's here. So welcome to the conference. Thank you.
All right, I'm ecstatic to be able to speak tonight, although speaking for 8 minutes is extremely challenging for me. As the Richies found out at dinner, when I start talking about my research, I get really excited and I have a lot to say and I'm really enthusiastic about it. So I will do my best to keep things very short. I am very grateful for the support that my lab has received from the gerontology program. We've worked very hard to use those resources efficiently. And I think we've been extremely successful at turning those resources into new and stronger resources and also important research findings. So I'll just briefly talk to you about some of the most recent findings we have and how they are changing our approach to understanding and solving Alzheimer's disease. So briefly, just some background on Alzheimer's disease. Those of you that attended this conference last year got all kinds of details about the disease, but it's characterized by the presence of plaques and tangles in the brain. So these features are, you can observe them at autopsy, you can stain the brain, and you can see these problems. And we don't know all the details about how the amyloid plaques and the tangles in the brain actually turn into the neuronal cell death and the symptoms that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And that's why we don't have effective cures right this moment. We don't know enough. We need to increase our base knowledge of this disease in order to solve it. Now, from a genetics perspective, that's what we can do. Right? We can actually understand the genetic basis for Alzheimer's disease risk and therefore provide new information about the genes, the pathways that influence the pathology of disease, and therefore provide targets for novel therapeutic approaches. And that's our goal. Now, the basic design that we use to find genes that alter risk for Alzheimer's disease is called the genetic association study. It's an extremely simple concept. We really just need two things to conduct this study. We need clinical diagnosis, and we need information about the genetic variation that each individual carries in their DNA. And clinical diagnosis can be extremely challenging for Alzheimer's disease. We all know the hallmark symptoms are memory loss, but a specialized clinician can actually go through a series of questions with a patient and assess whether they have memory loss that's normal for aging, or if they have specific types of memory loss that indicate Alzheimer's disease. There's some challenges with that, but it's a very simple and interesting approach. So one part of that, I like to do this with any audience, is a simple test. So they would say to the patient, repeat this phrase after me. So you guys all be the patients, right? I'm going to pretend I'm an MD, which I'm not, right? Just one little part here. So John Brown, 42 Market Street, Chicago. So go ahead. Okay. Now count backwards by 3 from 69. Okay. Now spell Brigham backwards. Okay. All right. That wasn't the test part. Now this is the test part. Repeat that phrase back to me. Okay. So this is a simple example of part of the clinical dementia rating, the thing that we use, the test that's used to assess clinical Alzheimer's disease. So a patient with Alzheimer's disease will actually struggle to recall the phrase after those distractors, and that's all the questions in the middle were. They're just distractors. They'd struggle to recall the phrase even with prompting. So they might forget part of it, and you could even say, oh, what city? It was a city. It was a city that started with C, and they still just can't recall that phrase. So you can see that's not a perfect approach, but it's the best we can do to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So when somebody like me can get a hold of a very large data set with lots of Alzheimer's cases and lots of non-demented controls and a lot of genetic information, we'll do a simple test to see if any of those genetic variants are correlated with the disease. So I've got here a simple diagram, and you can see right now that genetics is really easy because you can look at this diagram and say which shape is associated with being an Alzheimer's case. Tell me. It's the circle, right? It's pretty simple, right? If you were to look at someone's DNA and they had 2 circles as their markers, then you would say there's a very good chance that you're going to be an Alzheimer's case, right? It's very simple, straightforward stuff. So what's complicated about this? Well, there's 2 things that are challenging, and the challenges that my lab is trying to solve in order to solve Alzheimer's disease. The first is that we don't look at one genetic marker, we look at more than 3 billion all at once. That's a little bit more challenging than one marker. And the other challenge is that we're looking at tens of thousands of cases and controls at the same time. So we're managing extremely large data sets to try to understand the specific genetic markers that are altering people's risk for Alzheimer's disease. So with the few minutes that I have left, I'm going to walk you through a paper that we recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And by recently, I mean January, so extremely recently. And we were actually funded for the preliminary data of this project by the Gerontology program. And so this research actually came as a result of, at least in partial, result of the funding provided by this program. So the title of the paper is pretty straightforward, TREM2 variants in Alzheimer's disease. And there's a lot of authors on this paper because it actually includes whole genome sequence from 1,000 Alzheimer's cases and 1,000 non-demented controls. And it takes a lot of resources to develop that type of data set. The main players in this group were Brigham Young University, University College London, the National Institutes of Health, and the Washington University School of Medicine. These are the 4 key groups that put this paper together. And we did something very simple. We basically did this, but we did it with many people and many genetic markers. And what we found was quite striking, and you don't need to see this. I should have zoomed in on one of these markers, but essentially what we found was that as we looked at this particular gene called TREM2, and I'll talk more about that gene in a moment, we found several different changes in that gene that changed the function of the gene directly and very, very clearly changed the function of the gene. And among those markers, we found several that were present either only in cases and not in controls, or were much more frequent in Alzheimer's cases than they were in controls. And specifically, we focused on one marker. It's called R47H, and I thought I'd have an arrow. There we go, except for it's going the wrong way. So R47H, and what that means is that at the 47th position in that protein, there's a change of the amino acid. So a part of the protein got changed to something else. And as we examined that particular change, it became clear that when that change occurred in the protein, it destroyed the function of TREM2. Now, people are able to be born and to mature and live without normally functioning TREM2. Or with half of their TREM2 not functioning properly. But what we saw is that it actually increased your risk for Alzheimer's disease 6-fold to have this one change in your DNA that altered this protein. And that is an extremely large genetic effect, one of the largest genetic effects that's been seen in complex human disease ever, which was something really interesting for us to understand, to look at and to start to try to understand. So why is this interesting? Well, it turns out that the TREM2 gene codes for a protein that sits in the membrane and is involved in signaling for 2 processes. One is inflammation, so it alters the way that your brain cells respond to signals for inflammation. And the second is waste clearance, so it actually alters the way that your cells take waste from inside and remove them from the cells. And what we found is that specifically it looks like what's happening is when this gene doesn't work very well and your brain starts to build up those amyloid plaques, it can't clear them because the signal that TREM2 is supposed to be sending isn't occurring properly. So the final part of why this is interesting has to do with what we all care about, right? The aging process and being able to age in a healthy and strong and vital way. Well, Alzheimer's disease obviously doesn't allow that. It devastates families, physically, emotionally, financially. It's just devastating and costly. And the current technology for Alzheimer's disease doesn't work. Right? The treatments are not effective. The drugs that have been developed and approved aren't working well. And the prevailing hypothesis about this is something we heard last year, is that the reason for that is we're starting treatments too late. The drugs might work, but we don't know because we're not starting them until people's neurons are already dead, their cognitive function is already impaired. And there are actually 5 clinical trials that have been started right now using existing and some new drugs. And the whole goal of those trials is to identify people before they develop symptoms and start the treatment 5 or 10 years before they should develop the symptoms and see if we can stop them. The problem with that is we have to be able to justify that treatment. We have to say, you don't have any disease, but there's a high probability that you will in the near future. Therefore, you need to, it's worth the risk of side effects to start this treatment. Now, right now, today, only 1% of Alzheimer's cases can be clearly diagnosed with genes to say you will get disease or your probability is very high. And our finding here of this TREM2 variant actually triples the number of individuals that could be justified to be treated well before symptoms develop. So the potential impact of this work is very large, and we're grateful for the resources we've received from the Gerontology program to move this work forward, and I thank you for your time.
I'm also very pleased to be able to share some of our work that we're doing in our lab, and I'm also very grateful for support from the Gerontology program last year and actually over the last few years as part of our collaboration. I'm in the Department of Microbiology and Molecular Biology here, and we've been interested for the last few years in some issues related to anxiety and stress disorders in older people. And so we started a project a few years ago between Dr. Call and Dr. Hedges in psychology department, and more recently Mike Larson and Julianne Holt-Lundstad have joined in this project, where we're very interested in the genetic predisposition for the susceptibility to stress, anxiety, and depression disorders as people age. And in the past, there have been a lot of publications, many publications, that have reported on specific changes in the DNA that are associated with a high probability of developing this disorder. So as Dr. Kauwe mentioned, there's these genetic variations, changes in the DNA that are associated with these things. And so we're looking at just a few specific DNA polymorphisms, and what we have been able to do over the last few years is collect about 775 senior citizens participants who've contributed a saliva sample for isolating DNA so that we can have the source of DNA. And about 300 of those are from healthy athletic seniors who participated in the Senior Olympic Games in 2008. And then we collected another 145 last year. And then the remainder of the samples are controls, or not controls, but from another study group here of senior citizens in Utah County. So we have a group that's a very physically active a group, and then more of a general population. And our hypothesis has been that significant physical activity, meaning preparation for and participating in these athletic events, would be associated with a lower incidence of alleles that are associated with anxiety and depression. That's our starting idea as we went through this. So first of all, we have an idea that Dr. Kauwe mentioned that I wanted to just illustrate a little bit more. We all have DNA, our chromosomes have basically the same types of gene sequences, but there are regions where, as highlighted here, where we have something called a single nucleotide polymorphism, a base change, and many of these are not associated with anything in particular. They're just kind of random changes. Specific ones, like the one he talked about that changes an amino acid in a protein, that would be a serious problem. But many of these other ones are not, and SNPs can, the one he talked about was within a gene, a change within a gene that affects a protein, but many of these are actually in the regions of the DNA close to the gene, but not actually directly in it. So a change so the change doesn't directly affect a protein, but you can still see an association with that. So in my laboratory, we've been able to isolate the DNA from these saliva samples, and we do a process called polymerase chain reaction, which allows you to amplify a specific region of the DNA. So in one human cell, we have enough DNA that if you stretched it out from the floor up, it would be about 6 feet tall, about as tall as an average person, or a little bit taller than an average person. But we can't really look at all of that at the same time directly, but in this approach we target specific regions that, again, other researchers have already found that are associated with these base changes that are associated with these disorders. And so we can design primers that flank the region of interest, and we go through a PCR process where we make a lot of copies of the DNA, enough so that now we can look at just that piece of DNA. And so we can see, we can amplify the region so that then we can look for differences. And the way we detect the differences is we take the PCR product from this on the left here, and we cut it with a restriction enzyme. Restriction enzymes we sometimes call molecular scissors. They cut the DNA at very specific locations in the DNA. And so we can distinguish DNA molecules that get cut and those that don't get cut. And these enzymes cut at very specific sites. So the example here is one enzyme. It recognizes this 6-base sequence in the DNA. And if we have a SNP there where we change that first A to a G, the enzyme no longer will cut. So this one will cut with the enzyme, this one won't, but it's just a simple variation. And so this illustrates down here, if that cut site is there, we would make 2 fragments by cutting. We'd get a cutting at 1, 2, and 3, and if that site is changed, just that one, now we just get cutting on the outside, and we get a larger piece of DNA. So we actually have used this to look at specific targets, and the first one I'm going to show here is the glucocorticoid receptor. And this has been linked with stress levels and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this illustrates the idea that if the enzyme cuts, you get 2 bands, and if it doesn't cut, you're going to get just the higher band. And so these kinds of patterns, or these changes in our DNA, are inherited. They don't happen every generation, and so you can track these changes and look at this. So that's the general idea. Here's some of our results with the glucocorticoid receptor, where we've amplified the region of the DNA and then cut the DNA and run it out on an agarose gel. So we see the different patterns, and these that are indicated by the arrows are the bands that didn't get cut, and that's the uncut DNA pattern that is associated with the stress disorder. So that's for one of them. This is an undergraduate student that's working in my lab on this and some related projects. So that's one of them. Another one is the dopamine receptor gene, DRD2. It's linked with mood disorders. And we have the same idea. We can amplify the DNA and then cut it with a restriction enzyme. And again, the pattern where you see the DNA that didn't get cut. By the way, when you cut the DNA, you make the pieces smaller on these gels. The smaller DNA moves faster. And so it's the larger fragments that stay closer up here to where the DNA is loaded in the gel. So this pattern indicated by the arrow then is the one that's associated with higher susceptibility to mood disorders. And so in this case, we've been able to screen, this just shows a few samples, but we've been able to screen many samples for this. And so our results in this case, we actually found, so our hypothesis that we'd get a lower incidence of this allele, and we actually found in the athletic seniors a higher incidence. So in looking at the literature and analyzing this, we've proposed that this allele, this pattern, may actually be associated with healthy aging in certain environments. There's another student that's working in my lab. The other thing we're working on, serotonin receptor, the same kind of an idea that we're working on here. And just to kind of wrap up, the work that's done in my lab is entirely being carried out by undergraduate students. Some of them have been supported by the funding from the Gerontology program. And I list most of their names there. It's been a great opportunity for them. And I mentioned about the dopamine, but we're still working on the analysis of the results and interpretation of the other data for the other receptor gene targets. And we're working with Dr. Kauwe on some projects, and we're also doing some other things in the lab. So it's been very interesting and rewarding. And I'd just like to say thanks to the students working in my lab, and also thanks to the Gerontology program again and all those who've donated to make that possible. Thank you.
I'm pleased to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Dr. Rosemary Blieszner is Alumni Distinguished Professor of Human Development, Associate Dean of the Graduate School, and Associate Director of the Center for Gerontology at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. That's Virginia Tech, located in Blacksburg, Virginia. She is currently serving as President-elect of the Gerontological Society of America, and she recently completed her term as Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Gerontology, Psychological Sciences. Dr. Blieszner received her PhD from Pennsylvania State University in Human Development Family Studies, with an emphasis in adult development and aging. Her research focuses on family and friend relationships, life events, and psychological well-being in adulthood and old age. She has studied the contributions of spirituality to resiliency and how families cope with the diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment in an old relative. Dr. Blieszner is the co-editor of 3 books, 1 on adult friendship and 2 on aging in the family. She's also co-authored 3 books, 1 on adult friendship and 2 on spiritual resiliency in later life. She is the author of numerous articles published in Gerontology, Family Studies, and Personal Relationships journals. Dr. Blieszner is a fellow with several national professional societies, including the American Psychological Association, the Association for Gerontology in Higher Education, the Gerontological Society of America, and the National Council on Family Relations. In 1997-98, she received Virginia Tech's Alumni Award for Teaching Excellence, and in 2002, she was named Alumni Distinguished Professor, a position held by only 10 faculty members at Virginia Tech. In sum, Dr. Blieszner is a renowned scholar in family studies and gerontology. During my doctoral program at Virginia Tech, I had the chance to take a class from from Dr. Blieszner, and she also served on my dissertation committee. I have grown to appreciate Dr. Blieszner's attention to theory, her broad perspective of good science, and her kind and supportive mentoring. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Rosemary Blieszner.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks also to the people I've met already today for such a warm welcome. It's my first visit to Utah and to Brigham Young University, and I'm very happy to be here with you this evening. I would like to talk with you about research on friendship. I imagine that most of you have friends. About 95% or more of the population in the United States admits to having friends, and I think that most of us could say that they are very important parts of our lives. And so we were interested in taking a look at what is it about friendship that makes it so important and that does contribute to our health and our psychological well-being. Now, actually, friendship is a lifelong relationship. Even little babies can kind of engage in friendship. They might not have the deep conversations that we have as adults, but they'll kind of observe each other and play by each other and kind of interact in a way, and they're really at that point starting to learn something about the give and take that we think of as friendship as we move on through life. And it's an important role to study in the sense that it's a role that we can have all through life. Sometimes as we go along, we lose some of the kinds of roles and relationships that we've had, but friendship is something that you can always engage in. And so it's interesting from that point of view. The research that I did had to do with taking a look at older adults' friendships. We had individuals who were sort of in the young old, middle old, and old categories, and we wanted to break it down that way because everyone before we were doing this research had kind of aggregated as if it's all the same, and we know that there's a lot of developmental change that happens over those stages of the adult and later life years, and so we wanted to investigate those in our study, and we wanted to be sure that we had men and women in the research and that we would ask questions that were sensitive to the kinds of friendships that both men and women pursue in their life. We also thought it was important to conduct a random sample of subjects because we had found that an awful lot of the studies done before we were doing this were done with just kind of local convenience samples, and we thought we really wanted to be representative. So we developed, this was a while ago, and we used random digit dialing technology, you know, to identify the sample, and I want to tell you, it was so funny. We had like, I don't know, we made something like 12,000 phone calls in order to find a rather small sample of people who met our age and sex criteria, because we were filling the cells randomly too. It was kind of one of those things that you don't want to really do in research. It started out as a good idea, but it was really very labor intensive. But anyway, we found our sample and we went to their homes, we did face-to-face interviews, and we not only asked them questions about themselves, but we also got complete friendship networks from them, which was another sort of novelty. We didn't have the resources to go and interview all of the friends that they named, but at least we got a lot of details about their friends. So that's what a lot of the research that Jeremy mentioned that's in the books that we did in our journal articles that we've published, and I'm not really going to go into all of that today, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background about the kind of place that I'm coming from in reporting to you tonight. So, what happens in early life friendship? Well, in the very young stages of life and in the school age years and maybe even in moving into the teenage years of life, these are some of the things that happen where people are learning the foundational elements of social interaction that contribute to the ability to make friends and establish good working relationships, and of course also relationships. This all applies to their family and their teachers and other people in their lives as well. But these are important kind of fundamentals to have. You know, learning how to express emotions and language and social skills, companionship, figuring out what you're interested in and how to identify what other people are interested in and who you might like to interact with. Children will report about how friends make them happy or make them distressed, so they can get a sense of being supported by their friends even very early in life, and also this idea of validation, of self-worth. If somebody likes us, it makes us feel we're worthy of being liked, and it makes us feel good about ourselves. Friendship, it can help with what we call anticipatory socialization. So if my friend experiences something before I do, I can observe and learn from that, and it can be very helpful for smoothing the way for my own developmental transitions that I would be going through, and developing a sense of competence as a result of having those kinds of experiences. Whether they're successful or not, you can learn from them and move on. And so we realize that the foundation is laid for what characteristics and abilities we bring into friendship when we move into the adult years. Now, in adulthood, all of those features are still present and active and are the kinds of things that people talk about when they're reporting on their friendship and friendships and on the value of friendships and the meaning of friendships to them. But one of the things that's also unique about the friend relationship, and it really comes out in adulthood, is the notion that friendship is really a voluntary relationship. Of course, you can only be friends with people that you get to know somehow or other. So there's not an unlimited universe of people to be friends with, but we have a lot more choice about who we're friends with than might be the case for who we work with or who are our relatives or our neighbors and so on. So it's considered to be a voluntary relationship that we enter into, and we sustain it because we want to. That might not always be the case in other relationships in our lives. And in adulthood, more so than any other time of life, we have a very broad range of contexts in which we can find friends and engage in friendship activities. So all of the different places and spaces in life that you spend time are potential sources of friends for you. And one of the things that we did in our study, before we asked the people about the friends per se, we said, where are the places, what are the contexts of your life? We didn't use those words, but you know, what do you do, where do you go? And then once we established that we had a pretty thorough array of important ways that people spent their time, then we went back through them systematically and asked who were their friends in each of those contexts. And as a result of that, the average number of friends that we had in our sample was higher than what is usually found in national surveys, where people will just say, how many friends do you have? And people, you know, maybe pick a number off the top of their head. But because I think we were so systematic about having them think about how they spend their lives, we got a higher sample, a higher average rather in our sample. It was around 17 instead of 5 or 6. And the range was from 1 to 132. I got to do the interview with a person who had 132 friends, and it took 2 days to kind of go through all of them, but we did it. So you can see that, you know, there was quite a variety, and these were real names of real people that they were, you know, thinking out systematically. It wasn't just made up kind of numbers. It was very intentional. Well, anyway, so we spend our time in a lot of different ways in adulthood compared to in childhood, and so we have the chance for a greater diversity of types of friends and of interaction patterns. And one of the, let me give you an example from the study of one of the things that happens with this. Typically, researchers will say that we're friends with people who are very similar to ourselves, and so we decided we would specifically asked that question. Do you think it's important to be friends with people who are like you? And pretty much everybody said, oh, no, that doesn't matter. You know, like they were very open-minded, right? They wanted to make sure that, you know, we understood that they were like, you know, people who were open and willing to meet lots of people. Well, remember, though, we had data on all 132 or however many friends that they had, all of their personal characteristics, and what we found was even though they said that similarity wasn't that important, actually their friends were just like them. And you know, most of them were friends with people of the same gender and same race and the same religion, and they of course had a lot of shared interests. That's one of the things that makes friends be friends in the first place. And so they were thinking that it wasn't important, but their behavior really suggested that it was. Well, anyway, some people told us that they had intentionally made friends who were very different from themselves. They could have been very much younger, they could have had a very different kind of background or had very different interests. Why? Because they liked this novelty that people who are very different brought into their lives. They found it stimulating and interesting to have friends like that. Now that was the minority, definitely the minority, but it is an example of the diversity that's possible in adult friendship that can come up. Now, we talk about friends in many different kinds of ways, and in a sense, we think of the same kind of language almost that we use for families, and friends are like families in certain ways. But, you know, you've probably heard people say, like, you know, my friend and I are so close, we're just like brothers. Maybe you've heard, or maybe you feel that way about someone. Or maybe something like, my sister is my best friend. You know, so we have that kind of overlapping. Or one time I got a wedding invitation that said, on this day, I will marry my best friend. So you have that overlap of a notion of spouse and a notion of friend, right? And that's a situation that is sort of blurring the images. And in fact, a lot of times we talk about them in the same kinds of ways, but we also know that there are some boundaries. So we have also a sense of this is just staying in the family, right? And we have a sense of what stays in the family and what is possible to go and share with others outside of the family. And when we think about friendship in the later years of life and other things that are going on in the later years of life, some of the things like caregiving are probably really prone to making those boundary distinctions, even though there can be a lot of overlap between family and friends. So that when there's illness and disability, then people are probably going to rely more on their family than on their friends, but they get affection and emotional support from friends as well as from family. So in what ways are friends like family? Well, I already said emotional closeness is very important, whether you're talking about friends or family. And, you know, certainly a hallmark that most of us consider important for family, but many people think that emotional closeness is one of the key definitions of friendship. in our study, after we asked them about all the contexts, then we said, what's your definition of friendship? So that we could understand the characteristics of the people that they were telling us, how they fit into that. And then we were able to code and analyze the characteristics of the definition of friendship in our study. Well, anyway, family and friends both have a shared history. And in the later years, there are people who make new friends all the time, but there were many people who reported on friends that they still had from childhood, or more likely maybe from high school, that they still considered to be very important in their lives. So those were long-term relationships that they had carried through their adult years. In both relationships, there's a notion of interdependence, and so we expect there to be giving and receiving back and forth across both of those kinds of relationships. And we have notions of getting support and giving support that are applicable to both of them. We have also in both relationships this kind of notion of delayed reciprocity, and what I mean is that we don't, that giving and taking doesn't have to be immediate. It can be kind of banked for future use. You know, I'll tap into that source of support when I need it, when the time comes that something's going on that I need it. And I think that the only time in friendship when reciprocity is immediately required is in new friends, where you haven't built up a sense of trust that you can rely on them over the long time, so that if you give now, you'll get, you know, something that you need later on when you need it. And then there's this notion of just being there for each other, unconditional acceptance. I'm going to tolerate you no matter what, you know, what you do, and I'll love you forever no matter what happens. And we have those feelings with family members and with friends both. We believe that we can count on each other no matter what. But friendships are unique too. And so let's have a look at what ways that they are unique. I already mentioned the fact that these are chosen relationships, and the fact that we can voluntarily sort of pursue developing a friendship, an acquaintanceship into a deeper friendship, or we can let the acquaintanceship stay, you know, at that kind of level. One of the really interesting things that's happening now is with social media, what is the definition of a friend? You know, and if you have 632 people in your Facebook page, you know, is that like all about friendship or what? You know, and I haven't done any research. I know that there are some social scientists who are studying friendships that are cultivated through social media, but certainly the fact that you can get to know people through the internet means that the pool of potential friends is much bigger than ever, because it can be worldwide. In the beginning, I said, you know, you can only be friends with people that you meet. But now we have opportunities to meet people who don't, you know, that don't depend on face-to-face kind of interactions. And so there's kind of a whole new arena of research to be done in that place, I think. Now, this notion of voluntary interactions is very important in terms of a unique feature of friendship. It seems that one of the research findings is that relationships with friendships seem to contribute more to well-being in the later years of life than do relationships with family. And this is one of the explanations for why that would be so. If you can voluntarily create and maintain friendships, then that relationship is likely to be perceived as less obligatory, if you know what I mean. You know, like where families, you know, it's like home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in, right? And so, you know, that isn't kind of applied to friendship in the same way. And so the notion that it's a voluntary relationship can sometimes mean that it's more rewarding in certain ways to people. The idea of perceived control has to do with the importance of autonomy and control, so that making decisions about the relationship rather than having them made for you, it contributes to psychological well-being. The same with reciprocity. Reciprocity, when we asked about the definition of friendship, was one of the few things that people did mention consistently across everybody. One was shared interests and affection and emotional support kind of idea, and then another one was that this ability to rely on each other and to have trust that you can count on the other person for your needs, and you'll help them when they have needs too. And then the fact that I mentioned before that in all through life, the friendship role can endure and the functions of friendship can endure, and it doesn't depend on whether you're married or not, or whether you have children or not, or whether you have disabilities or not. You know, friendship can still be there regardless of that. So I want to share some of the research findings about ways that what affects friendship, and one of the elements that affects friendship and the kinds of friendships that we have are the personal characteristics that we have. So that here you can see the demographic characteristics, and then also want to point out that friendships affect the development of the people who are partners in them. And so it's not just like, you know, my personality characteristics, but it's also the fact that the relationships that we're in feed back, and they help to influence our developmental pathways through role modeling, through helping us to build skills, through the networking functions that we talk about a lot, and for how that they can help to improve our well-being and promote our development. So friends are, individuals are often highly influenced by friends, and we talk a lot about that in the development of adolescents being particularly susceptible to friendship influence in their lives, but it's true really all through life. It might not be, you know, to quite the same extent, but I think that if we look for how friendship affect individual development, we can find examples of that really all through life. And two, friendships are dynamic relationships. They are not static, stable necessarily. And if it's important to understand what makes friendships be stable and what makes friendships change in the if we want to understand people's relationships and how to help them in it. So the personal and social resources that people bring to their relationships foster stability. Because remember, I said that people end up typically being friends with folks who are very much like them. Because one of the definitions of friendship is companionship, compatibility, shared interests, that kind of thing, then it's very likely that the people you're friends with will reinforce the things that you are interested in and the things that you like about yourself, and that contributes to stability of the relationship. And if you repeatedly interact with people, and if the friendship endures over time, then that also contributes to its stability. It's sort of reinforcing all of those interests and characteristics that I've mentioned. But at the same time, when we look at the adulthood years, we know that there are developmental changes that occur. There are age-related changes that occur in roles and in relationships and in our personal health and functioning. And those age-related changes in life events can have an impact on friendship changes too. And some of that kind of change that occurs might be due to people moving away because of, you know, graduating from college and taking off to work at a new location, or getting transferred within the work situation that you are. There are people do change their interests occasionally. They develop some new interest or experience that they don't have in common with that person, so they might cultivate new friendships instead or in addition. Sometimes people lose contact with each other for various reasons. They might not make the effort, to maintain the relationship. And sometimes they become unable to do that reciprocity. And it depends on how you define, what you need and what you want. And so there are, if people were, if the friendship involved engaging in activities that had to do with going out and about and doing things or playing tennis together or things like that, and the person can no longer do that because of age-related changes, then that might have an impact on the friendship. However, the social support, the emotional support, the caring and affection can endure for a long, long time through life. So we have to look at that in a lot more detail, but I just wanted to make this point that friendships can have reasons for changing. So let's take a look at what, in a little bit more detail, what some of the roles of friends are in our lives. We have discovered a lot about how friends can contribute to our physical well-being, and they do this by helping and encouraging us to lead healthier lives, or they could encourage us in the other direction to not, to lead less healthy lives. James Fowler spoke about his book called Connect at the Gerontological Society conference in November, and he was talking about his research on social network that really shows how people's health habits are influenced by the social network that they hang out with. So the people who are spending more time with people who have healthy lifestyles tend to be in better physical shape than people who are spending a lot of time with people who have less healthy lifestyles. And so they can, friends, and a lot of times people in our study talked about this in helping each other in the adult years when there's illness or an accident or surgery that they've had, that the friends really, they appreciated the fact that their friends stepped in and helped them with meals or transportation, and that helped to promote their recovery. And also then things like motivation, as I just said, eating and exercising well, and that sort of thing can be a role that friends play in our lives. Also, they contribute to psychological well-being in that there is an important, for most people, an important component of friendship that has to do with somebody that we can trust and confide in. There was a study done a long time ago that showed that it was really the quality of the relationship, not the quantity, that counts. And so in that research, there was a distinction made between the people who had at least one confidant and the people who had none at all. So one or more versus none or all. And the people who had at least one confidant were much better off in terms of psychological well-being than those who had nobody to confide in. And so that is a very important, I'm going to talk a little bit more about stress in a minute, but that's a very important component of it. And then friends contribute to our social well-being too. I mentioned the notion of anticipatory socialization, and that's not just for children or for young adults. That's also like if I can observe somebody who is managing retirement or coping with widowhood, then it can help me to learn, what do I need to do? How can I make some successful adjustments? Or maybe I learn from them things that weren't so successful, and that helps me too. And then the idea of being involved in a network that is able to give us new social connections can be very important. And then the idea of role continuity, that I can always be a friend, even if I'm retired, even if I'm widowed, even if I'm not so healthy any longer. Now, one of the most interesting and I think important lines of research that has been underway recently, has kind of been hinted on by our two previous speakers a little bit too, is this notion of how friends can affect our physical and psychological well-being by buffering stress and helping us to deal with whether it's everyday hassles or whether it's much more traumatic kinds of events. So when we experience stress, stress, it sets up this cascading system of endocrine functions that are disrupting our normal immune system reactions and ability to cope with infectious diseases and things like that. And there's been a lot of research showing how the development of chronic stress is negative in terms of our susceptibility to infectious diseases and coronary heart disease and so forth. But there is also the complementary possibility that having that confidant, having somebody who's willing to sit with you or willing to offer you whatever kind of support you might need, can really help to mitigate some of those effects and therefore reduce the likelihood of either physical illness or depressive symptoms as a result of having major or even minor stresses going on in life. And so this idea of providing the emotional support, lending a sense of identity and worth, that even though I feel like my life is a mess right now, there's somebody who's still going to believe in me, is a very important feeling to have. Offering assistance and advice, sharing meaningful activities and interests. And for older adults in particular, but people really of all age do worry about loneliness. That idea that if I have a friend, I don't have to worry about being lonely is a really important way of keeping down worries and concerns and stressors. Now, at the same time, we know that like other relationships, sometimes friendships have problems and things don't go so well. And there can be a lot of reasons why there could be trouble between friends. And this is one of the things that we studied in our project too. And we found that these were the typical kinds of causes and types of difficulties that the older adults mentioned. But I think even though we were studying that sample, these also pertain to other stages of life. So, you know, nobody's perfect. Everybody has their little foibles and things that we might not really love about each other. But what we found is that older adults in particular, at least the ones in our sample, seemed better able to tolerate the sort of nuisance aspects of their friends. That some reports of friendship in college-age students or younger people, those people are much more likely to ditch the friends that are bugging them. But the older adults, they talked about it and they had concerns about it, but they also said, well, you know, she's still my friend, I'm still going to tolerate her. But if the relationship isn't solid enough, then those could build up, I guess, and those could lead to problems in the friendship. We also found a category of situations that weren't really about the two people. They were external to the relationship that might cause problems for them. And so it would be, for example, moving away, where it's harder to keep in touch, becoming ill so that you become much more focused on yourself, or maybe a family member who's very ill, someone that has other responsibilities that come up, changes in job, changes with family. And so we did have some accounts from people about them really drifting apart because of these external, sometimes it was work-related, things like that. But it also could be they were drifting apart because they felt that their lives weren't really meshing any longer. There was one gentleman who talked about having run a business, it was a photography business, with his friend, and they had that going for a long, long time, but eventually they started having a lot of disagreements about how they were going to manage this business and things like that, and they figured out their values had kind of shifted and they weren't in sync so much any longer, and they decided that they had to actually end that business and their friendship along with it. Some of the people in the study were really indifferent about that kind of change. They just said, oh, well, that's what happens. Other people were distressed by the loss of that kind of a friendship. The last one, major betrayals, was very distressing to everybody. Now, we asked a question of the people, did you ever end a friendship on purpose? And very few people said they did. But the ones who did, it was because of a major betrayal, and it was very upsetting to them, whatever the situation was that went on. And they felt that the relationship had so disappointed them or had become so toxic that they really had to end it on purpose. And they said that the way they did that was to be pretty direct about it. Now, there have been studies about how younger people, teenagers and college-age people end friendships, and they tended to just sort of like not see, you know, don't bump into each other, you know, stop replying to messages or whatever. And so they took a more indirect approach. But the older people really felt that it was important to be direct about it. So the promises and the perils, and then the last area that we investigated in our study was what are the processes of the friendship interactions that people undergo. And we looked at the processes in terms of how they made friends, how they kept them, and then how they ended them. So making friends, really, this information comes from the work of a researcher named Gerontology, who had a theory about how relationships develop. And we used his theory to ask questions of the people in our study about these characteristics and found them to be endorsed by the subjects, the participants in our study too. So in order to make friends, to move from acquaintance stage to the friendship stage, people have to really have enough time enough frequency of meeting. Otherwise, if you don't, you just kind of stay as an acquaintance. But beyond that, not just about meeting often, because you could see the same cashier at the grocery store every week and not really become friends with that person, right? But it's also having enough time for self-disclosure, so that sharing of important information about yourself, about your history, and receiving that self-disclosure from the other person is a fundamental characteristic of friendship that's very important, and it takes time to get comfortable and to have trust to be able to do that. And then that also requires having a more opportunity for more private interactions, so that if you're always meeting in, you know, large public groups, then that might not happen as much. And again, here's a place for social media research to move in, because people have a lot of private time when they're texting or looking, you know, using the internet in other ways. And so how are people sharing their friendships and sharing about themselves and building up friendships through those media? Now, when we asked, what do you do to keep your friends? What they said was that it's very important, they felt, to show that you care about the other person. It doesn't mean you have to be all lovey-dovey all the time. It might be that you answer the phone. It might be that you are willing to go do something or run an errand for somebody. So whatever means would show you care would be appropriate. Providing emotional support, attending to important matters in the friend's life. So paying attention to what's going on in their life and remembering to ask, well, how did that visit with your family go? Or what's, oh, it's your birthday today, you know, like happy birthday, or whatever, you know, might be going on. And so you're showing that you care enough about them to take an interest in what's happening with them. And then the last thing that they said was really important for keeping friends is to resolve any of those minor issues that come up that I mentioned before they become big issues. And so it's just really good advice for any relationship at any stage of life, isn't it? That if there is a conflict or a difficulty or a misunderstanding, to work it out so that it doesn't ruin the relationship. And then, as I said, the idea of parting with friends was not that common, aside from the ones that sort of drifted away unintentionally. The intentional ending of friendships wasn't very common. But when we said, well, what would you do? They said, you know, they would reduce contact or end the relationship. Pretty straightforward there, I think. So let me give you some summary points that I hope will pull this all together for you. Friendships occur all through life, and we all should look forward to having friendships all through our lives. Friendships are dynamic. They change and grow as we change and grow and develop. And we may take new ones on as we go all through life, as well as keeping some of those that are important to us from long ago. Friendships contribute to each other's development and well-being in many ways. I think it's a relationship worth paying attention to, not overlooking as scholars, as people working in human development services and interventions, to remember the role that friends can play as people in health professions too, that friends are sometimes overlooked, I think, and they can really help the family to manage and cope with big problems that might be happening in the later years. Friends offer caring and support in unique and important ways that are sometimes similar to what family members are doing, but also often very different. And making and keeping friends requires both attention and intention, so that we cultivate and sustain those relationships that make us happy and contribute to our well-being. So I would be happy to talk with you about friendship. I think, are the posters here? Are we going to look at the posters you mentioned? They're out in the hallway, and so if we go out in that direction, we can chat if you have any questions. And I thank you very much for your attention this evening.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And speaking of friendship, we have a small gift to give to you to remind you of the time here.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful Y. Actually, inside is a clock to remind you of your time here.
Oh,
and BYU's logo on it, just to remind you where you were.
oh, that's so special. Thank you
So
very
I
much.
really appreciate your time here. And please, everyone, think of tomorrow at 11 o'clock. She's going to focus on friendships with respect to mild cognitive dementia types of issues. And as you get into gerontology, you understand this is the one area that really affects families significantly. Dealing with the mild levels to the more severe levels where you're dealing with Alzheimer's is really a challenge for families nowadays. So thank you very much for doing that and coming. Also, I'd like to invite a lot of the students are here. I know some of you are not gerontology majors. You've come out of curiosity, interest, or your teachers made you in some cases. Take a look at the gerontology program. It is a growing concern in our country, as some of us in the field refer to it as the silver tsunami that is hitting us right now. You have approximately about 10,000 people a day turning age 65. Think about growth industries. This one happens to be called aging. So I invite you to take a look at, in the program, there's a URL to our site if you're interested in looking at the requirements of getting into the program. Many of you may have completed some of the requirements already, and just taking a few more classes and you could end up with an academic minor or a certificate in gerontology. So take a look at that, and thank you for coming tonight.